All right, sounds good. All right, so this is a little talk I gave at a managers meeting. They suggested other people might be interested, so here I am. Most of this information is in Wikipedia. I've got some personal experience with it. I will try to flavor it, but if you really want to learn more, it's all there. So this is your parents' model, and their parents' model, if it goes back that far. So the first presentation in software development involving phases was back in 1956. So this is in the early days of computing. It was in support of a radar tracking system that NORAD was building. Most people trace the word waterfall to a paper by Winston Royce, who worked in aerospace and wrote an article in 1970. And he described waterfall, but he acknowledged it as unrealistic due to the fact that you really have to go back. So it was more of a straw man that he put up, but people latched on to the term. So it really became popular sort of in 1976, where it started to appear in papers, and then the Defense Department was starting to do more and more software by that time. Adopted it as their formal process. So there was other documentation around it, but it was an official DoD standard in 1985. Now, I've heard Barry Boehm, who's one of the big software process experts, as a professor at USC, talks about the waterfall process as really plan-based. That's another way to think about it. So it's plans and documents. It's the management is all around those two things. So you have to have a plan, and the purpose of the process is to produce documentation. It's typically shown like this. This shows overlap, but each of these phases produces artifacts, produces document artifacts. Or the goal of the phase is to produce the documents associated with that phase. This lists the most important documents that come out of it, but depending on the complexity of the situation, there could be lots and lots of variants of that, and lots of different documents. And of course, each of these has a plan associated with it. Now, the pure version is known not to work. So really what this did was spawn sort of a whole series of variants, which, given that the pure version didn't work, we're seeking out some version that did. So Royce's so-called final model did acknowledge feedback from these loops.
Just for a second, I'll get you to.
All right. Hello? So he put feedback loops in, and you can see arrows going back from one phase to the other. And he acknowledged that you would perhaps have to redo the documents and the artifacts from the prior phases. One of the variants that came up with was waterfall with sub-projects. So you might have a high-level requirements phase where you produce the requirements for the overall project or product, and then a high-level design phase where you produce the high-level designs. And at that point, you might split off into multiple parallel sub-projects, each of them with their own requirements, design, code, etc. This is fine, I guess. So one of the most popular processes was the rational unified process, which you may have heard in the Agile context, but it certainly is a waterfall variant. And it had, its phases were inception, or are, it's still going on, inception, elaboration, construction, and transition. And let's see if I can get this one here. So is that, let me get it. So here we go. And you can see here are the different phases, and they each have sub-phases, typically numbered. So you may have, you typically have one inception phase, some number of elaboration phases, and so on. And you can see the various disciplines, and this would show you would do more or less of that discipline in that particular phase. And this is just a sample. Any particular project might have different elements of these, but you can see they all go on in parallel. So this is an iterative model, but it still has these different phases of maturity, and you're still progressing through these. These points right here between the phases are typically called milestones or anchor point milestones, and they have names of their own. And there's certain objectives that you're supposed to hit at each of those milestones, which represent various levels of confidence and maturity in the project. So this is typically, what am I trying to produce? What are my goals? How am I going to produce it? This is the construction and then the transition. And then the other really popular model is the spiral model. This is what Barry Boehm has worked on quite a bit. Came out of his work on win-win requirements negotiations. And he calls this a process model generator, right? So the idea is you start in the center and you go around this circle, and each traversal around the circle, you're determining objectives, trying to identify the risks, doing development and test, and then you're planning the next iteration. And his point is, depending on what you're trying to achieve and what the risks associated with that, you could use a different process for each time through. But he too says it's important to maintain these invariants. You have to have life cycle objectives. What are the objectives that I'm trying to complete for this pass through? You need to get sign off from all your stakeholders on those objectives. What's the life cycle architecture? What's the architecture for this pass through? And so on and so forth. So it doesn't, it doesn't imply less planning, doesn't imply less documentation, but it says you're going to use risk to drive the process as you're going around the spiral. Yeah.
Is there, with the spiral getting wider, is there supposed to be an implication that the later phases take longer to go through development?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Although I'm not sure. Certainly in the early phases, you're likely doing more prototypes, more experimentation. As the product gets more complete, you've got more substance to it, so it's bigger. There may be more people involved, so cost may be higher. So, what are the supporting arguments for this? The main thing is that time and cost spent in the early phases saves money later on. Certainly, if you're building a building, right? You decide what your objectives are for the building. You do a design. You have architectural drawings. Going back and changing the number of floors you have after you've built it is very costly. So that's sort of the mindset of the physical world plays into this. And certainly in the before we got better at it, costs were extremely high. Cycles were extremely high when you went from requirements to design to implementation. I was watching a video by Bob Martin. He was talking about the early days of computing, which I was involved in, and they would say, well, the first thing you do is you'd write out your program, and then you get it key punched, right? And it could be like a 24-hour turnaround on the key punch, right? And then you get it back. You get back a stack of cards, right? You got to make sure the cards are right because any errors could be problems, right? So then you submit your deck. The deck gets run on the mainframe, comes back with its listing tied around it. You open it up and you find out you're missing a comma, a syntax error, and the whole thing's shot, right? So, I mean, the notion of these cycle times, particularly now if you have to go back and get requirements approved again, get design approved again, it could be really expensive to make changes. So the thought was, if I do a whole lot of this review, if I get everybody to agree to it, then the chances are a lot less they'll have to change it. Of course, we've learned that's a lot harder to do in practice. And this is the same thing. If I'm more comprehensive, if I'm more thorough, then there's less likelihood that I'm going to have to go back. And then there's the documentation. So the documents are the means by which they get concurrence from their stakeholders. That's the means by which they review everything. And they're there to support the next phase. So that's really the requirements or the instructions for the design. The design are the instructions for the coding. So it's all about getting those documents produced and getting them complete and getting everybody to agree to them. And also, because they're documents, of course, they can be shared, they can be sent out. Lots of people can read them. This is another big one, right? Unless you have some way to break down your work, you have no way to know how far along you are. So your stakeholders are paying all this money. They want a plan. They want to know how you're doing against your plan. So the natural way to do that is, well, I've got these milestones. And once I hit these milestones, if I've got a plan that's 10 units long and a milestone at 2 units, then I'm 20% done, right? So they can report progress against their plan. They can report progress against each of the phases of the waterfall process. And then I think another thing is, in the context of providing a bunch of money to developers that are going to go off and just write some software, this is a way to provide structure and discipline, right? So they have to produce the documents first. They have to get them reviewed. Then, of course, it gives a sense of control over what gets produced. And of course, we'd have no documentation, and that would be terrible. So this really is a set of values, I think. And it's not that we don't appreciate working software, but if you follow the process and use the tools, then you'll produce the right results. People are fungible. We really have to focus on the process and the tools. So again, this is process, documentation, plans. That's a key part of this culture. So following a plan, a key assumption here is that if I can just break the work down into small enough tasks and I can estimate those tasks and I can add up the tasks and I know how long the whole thing will take. And if there are dependencies, I can use PERT charts and critical path, and I can even figure all that out. And all this effort went into being able to get good estimates and combine them together to get a good plan so I can have predictability. So it's like, if I could just do that better, more finely, then I'm going to be successful. So that's this plan and this ability to break things down into tasks and then add them up. That's really a key part of this. The other thing I think is the plans imply deadlines, okay? If you have a deadline, then people are accountable because you get them to commit to the deadline, right? If you don't commit to the deadline, then they won't be bought in. So you got to have commitment. In order to have commitment, you need deadlines. In order to have deadlines, you need a plan. So one of the key things that would happen with all this is you go through this loop. Go to the developer and say, how long will this task take? It will take 4 days. Okay, I'm holding you to that. So you do that enough times, and the developer goes, whoa, there's not a lot of incentive for me to be aggressive here. So you say, well, next time around, how long does it take? It's going to take 6 days, and so on and so forth. Now, everybody does this, right? So then you take all those estimates and you add them up together, and now it looks like the project's going to take 2 years to complete because everyone's padding their estimates so they don't get beat up for not missing their dates. So they had various schemes, which is, okay, so why don't you give me your X% confidence state? And then what's the variant on that, all right? And they plug in those values, and they run it through their computer, and they get this predicted output. Now, that is actually better, right? But you still have people hovering over the individual tasks saying, are you done yet? Are you done yet? You said it would take 3 days, or 2 days, or whatever it was, which has created a lot of pressure, a lot of counter incentives in terms of quality. But again, the mindset is, and a lot of the mindset of our clients is, if you have a software project, you got to have a plan. The plan has tasks. People are committed to the task and the deadlines. That's how we manage. So when we come up and have an alternate process, that's the framework that they're going to be comparing it to. So the other key thing here is documentation. So if I've got a system and I've used one team to develop it, another team might support it, the documents are key, right? So documents on the requirements, documents on the design, high-level design, and documents in the code, comments in the code. That's all part of this culture. And of course, that allows the documents being distributed to others, unlike verbal communication. And again, they can be reviewed and approved. So if I have a document, then I can give my stakeholders and say, sign off on this. And by signing off on this, then you're now protected against them wanting to change it. And lastly is contracts. This sort of ties into the individual situation with developers. If you have vendors, same thing. You can't trust vendors, so you need some way to hold the vendors accountable. In order to have the vendor be accountable, there has to be something formal which describes what the vendor is going to deliver to you. So you get detailed specifications of what it is, when it's going to be delivered, some acceptable number of defects, et cetera, and a lot of attention goes into that contract and making sure that the contract spells out everything you expect. Again, based on the fact that you can't trust other organizations, so the contract's a way to protect yourself. And again, plans, firm dates, content from suppliers. So you may have noticed, these are all the 4 principles of the Agile Manifesto, except they're the other side of the left and right-hand side. But there's a legitimate argument for each of these coming from a particular mindset. And I believe that's it. So I open up for questions or experience people have had prior to here. John?
I had an observation and then a question. So one observation is that it seems to value the individual contribution and communication in favor of process. And I know that a big thing to be emphasized in labs is the value of the process. So how is what we say any different?
That's a good point. And actually, of all of the Agile principles, the one I had the hardest time with was the first one about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Because I really do believe that the process determines the outcome. But it's the nature of the process you use, right? I mean, a process can be formally defined and put 2 people in a room and ask them to do the right thing. I mean, that is a perfectly legitimate process, right? On the other extreme, you could have a process which literally tells them what to do for each unit of time going forward. So I think the explanation that I've heard is that when these guys use the term process, they were referring to something described in a thick document which was very specific about all the steps that people needed to follow. And the term process meant rules. So like having a strictly defined in great detail definition of what you should do and a rule that you should always do that. That's what they meant by processes. And so in that sense, I think that's problematic because process is just a bench line for continuous improvement, right? I mean, it's a way to think about it, I think. So it's a long way. I mean, I think we believe in our process. It's just we have a different view of what that process ought to be and how much freedom it gives people within the context. I don't know if there's anything.
What I'm hearing what you're saying there is it sounds a lot like the Industrial Revolution thinking of all we have to do is remove the variance in the movement on the assembly line, and that will improve the efficiency.
Right.
And I guess that might have been the thing that was fundamentally different about software is that you could only remove so much variance because it is soft and it's subject to so many different forces that assumption apparently became apparently invalid.
Right. Is there a question in the back? Comment in the back? Yeah, and there's a couple ways to answer that. One is you could argue that we do waterfall within each of our stories, on our projects, right? We start with some description of the goal, and you work that out during IPM, and you get a description which represents a requirement specification of sort, and the pair talks about what design approach they're going to take. It falls down a little bit later. But I think the principle makes, in some sense you could say, the principle makes sense. It's a matter of batch size, right? So the batch size for an office building is in some sense the whole office building, right? You can't build one floor. Well, I guess some of this is going out. They get built up for the bottom. But there's some things you have to do the whole thing at once. And so that's the way I tend to think of this in terms of the basic notion of requirements and design, code and test. We obviously like to reverse here, but the big principle there is if you work in very small batch sizes, you get better results than if you work in large batch sizes when you have that opportunity to do so. And that's also, I think, tied to this whole notion of planning and commitment, right? If your batch size is something that takes a half a day, right, then the whole idea of doing a plan and getting a review by a whole bunch of stakeholders, that whole process of getting concurrence and writing it down, it can literally take longer than the whole duration of that particular cycle. So I think this is largely an issue of scale, and you get these big issues when you work in large chunks with lots and lots of people. So our goal is work in small chunks with small teams of people and figure out a way to have that happen in parallel and then put together.
Is Waterfall the opposite of Agile?
Well, it's been used that way, but I mean you can see to the extent the Waterfall means do requirements and design and code and test, we're still doing it in some sense. So if it means do them entirely sequentially, well, that's really not the case, because no one really ever does that. It's just a matter of how much you go back. That's why I think it's more an issue of batch size and the amount of documents and plans and concurrences that you have associated with that.
You mentioned that Royce updated his model to have feedback loops from subsequent phases, but
Right.
maybe one other. Did it have feedback loops from the end back to
Yeah, it did. I mean, you may have had to traverse through it, but I mean, he certainly, when he wrote about it, he acknowledged that yes, you may have to go all the way back to requirements, after you've hit the middle of the testing phase because you discovered something.
like the answer, I think another contrast would be that you value getting that feedback loop.
Right.
Kind of like you're delivering stuff in the production and expecting that that's going to change the requirements.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, with the batch size goes the speed, right? If you can cut down the time it takes to move through and cut down the cost, then all sorts of things are possible. And you get in a situation where you're just running all these experiments with sort of the lean startup being the ultimate expression of all that, right? Just what's the quickest way I can run an experiment to get some feedback, which does not work real well when you're trying to go to the moon. Like you can't say, well, let's go to the moon and see how well that worked, and then we'll come back and we'll try going to the moon again.
The other factor that we didn't talk about was uncertainty. That even when you're going to the moon, the space in which you're working is of physics that everyone understands. And within the space of software, it's more complicated than that. There's more unknowns. There are social interactions and human requirements and environmental changes that we can't predict. So there's more uncertainty in software. And I think that is part of the justification for valuing feedback loops more than in the physical world where things fall over those mechanics.
Yeah, I guess I'd be hard pressed to think there wasn't more uncertainty going to the moon. But I mean, I think.
I can build a simulator that describes how physics work, but I can't build a
Yeah.
simulator that describes how software works.
Yeah. I mean, there are risks of asteroids, and I suppose not really understanding all of the physics associated with gravity on the moon. But yeah, there's been a, yeah. Was there a hand raised there? No? John?
So, I mean, there's a number of things in these values that I'm not sure I buy aren't important.
Okay.
Like, I don't know about you, but when somebody puts a deadline in front of me, I do find that it focuses me, and that I do find that, it helps me understand like what trade-offs are to make. So, what's so bad with that?
Okay. First of all, is that a common feeling? Deadlines help? Yes? No? Yeah. I guess. I mean, I certainly feel internal pressure when I'm working to get it done quickly. But for me, wanting to deliver value quickly, not wanting things to go on beyond a certain point or have it be proportional to the difficulty of the task, I feel like those things are all coming internal and it feels very different than a deadline. And my experience, when I have a deadline, a real deadline, I tend to make compromises I that I probably shouldn't be making. And that feels different than the pressure I feel to just continually perform at a level at which people say, boy, Pete's doing a good job. So that just feels different to me. I don't know, Dave?
I mean, I felt like that was a setup for reading the Agile manifesto again, because it says, well, we value the things.
Yeah.
We value the things that we like more. So even the Agile manifesto doesn't discount that these things are valuable. And how old is that thing now?
20-some, 30-some? I don't know. It's got to be 20. No, 15, 13, 2003? I just read it. All right.
So that might be worth revisiting.
Yeah, and I mean, there's certainly a variant of all of these that is true.
I like the difference of what you said in there, that it was internal motivation, right? So part of these, I think the difference between the two models are some base assumptions, like how much uncertainty there is in the system,
Mm-hmm.
and whether or not Pete and crew are properly motivated to not role play things into the plan,
Right.
and deliver value for the business. Where I had this blunt force tool before, where it's like, well, you can't squeeze much more in if I put a deadline in front of you.
Right. Well, and you won't slack off, which is that's the sense I had too, right? You want people really to be motivated. The way to motivate them is give them some deadline. And there's also this phenomenon. I don't know if this is true with Waterfall or not, but there's certainly a case where I know this project's going to slip, so I'll take their estimates, I'll cut them in half, and I will hold them to that unrealistic date with the thinking that I'll get it sooner than if I plan towards a realistic date. So we'll just hold them to that until it's obvious it can't be made, and I'll slip it a little bit and repeat. So.
But that's more a critique of how Waterfall has been implemented and actually across the world. I mean, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. That's true. But I think it's sort of it's associated with thinking that you can represent the project in terms of these concrete milestones, and then having a plan, and believing that if I produce this plan, then this plan will get me there in a more reliable way than if I didn't produce that plan. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, realize that.